live podcast sponsored by the Marin Fire History Group. All about the history of the fire service in Marin County, California. And now your host, retired Fire Chief Bill Lellis.
Good day again, and welcome to the Marin County Fire Chiefs Historical website. Today we're at Larkspur Fire Department in Larkspur, California, and we have, I believe, a wonderful treat for you. We have a retired captain from Larkspur Fire Department, born and raised in Larkspur, Jim Clark. He's going to take us through the Doug Archer historical room here at Station 15 and explain all of the antiquities that are present and been saved throughout the year. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Fire Captain Jim Clark of Larkspur.
Great. Thank you, Bill. Like Chief Lellis was saying, this is the Doug Archer Historical Room. Doug Archer was our deputy chief here for many years, retired in the 90s, and still lives in town. He really had the foresight to save a lot of the things here. And interesting, I started in 1976, and a lot of this equipment was still on the engine, and so I know it very well. But you know, starting down here, all this equipment was absolutely part of the Larkspur Fire Department and part of the engine companies and offices and stuff. Down here is just kind of all the different radios. Back then, before we had cell phones and stuff, we had plectrons, and these were home receivers that were operated on the radio frequency which we were operating on, and they were like an alarm at home. So 3 in the morning, this thing would go off, and you'd hear the radio traffic go off, and you'd come into the station. So we started with these older plectrons, went to some newer ones. Then we finally got these portable pagers, which was for us pretty high tech. So. And then the last one in the paging systems, we had these old phone pagers. So things kind of stepped up there. Down here are some of the old portable radios. You know, before we had the Mira system with repeaters, we had low band radios, and these maybe had 4 to 6 channels, and we used these mostly in like the 80s and 90s. So we still have our whole collection of portable radios here. The engine radios, when I left, we'd have up to 40 or 50 different channels on our engine radios. But when I started, we had these microphones, and we'd key the mic, and we had 2 channels on our engine. So if one channel was busy, we go to the second one. That was for all of Marin County. It was pretty interesting. So moving along, some of this equipment was stuff that's even as simple as a Rolodex. You know, you kind of look at this and you think, well, that's not really historical at all. Well, it really is. Not only are all the phone numbers historical, but this is kind of a bygone era of how we used to organize, you know, our phone system. We had an office downstairs, and we would do all that. This is an old civil defense helmet. So during the 40s and maybe the 50s, certain firemen were used in civil defense. And along with that, I'll talk to you later on about the air raid siren. Hi, so we're over here in some of the historical equipment. This is actually the equipment that was on the engine. You know, this was an old clay pipe nozzle. You know, and you know, we had all men back then, and like I said, men had to be men. This thing probably weighs about 20 pounds. 2.5 inch. We'd pull this up on the fire. These are some of the first what we call advanceable tips. This is an Acheron turbojet, and before advanceable tip was a new technology. You could take this, shut it down, take this nozzle off, and extend your hose line, and that was pretty much for us new technology. You know, we had a lot of different variations of nozzles. This is what we called an attic nozzle, where we'd stick it up through the attic, and then this would rotate around and spray water. We didn't use it very much, but it was very entertaining. And if it was a small attic, you'd use a small attic nozzle. So one piece of equipment that was pretty critical to the engine was what we called the Blake 4-way. And again, everything weighed a lot here. Everything was brass, very, very Um, very heavy for the time. And this was the Blake 408. This was pretty critical, especially in the older days. We didn't have water mains as big. We had a reduced water system. We would spin this onto the hydrant on the 2.5 there. We'd spin it onto the hydrant, and what would happen is the water would come out of the hydrant, go to the fire engine. They would take that water into the fire pump, pressurize it. It'd come back to the 408, and then it'd be delivered to the fire scene. So this basically was to help supplement and augment the pressure of the existing water system. Once we got new water mains in, and Marin County has really great pressure, this thing became obsolete. But they're still using these, but just in another kind of configuration. Other things on here that were, this was our original hose clamps. These were used for, obviously, for forestry fires and for wildland fire. And the original hose clamp we could use on single jacket 1.5 inch. All right, so I'm in an area about turnouts. When I started in the 70s, we still had this style coat. It's called a Hypalon. It really is nothing more than it's manufactured by Globe. It's more of a raincoat material than actually fire retardant. Now, finally in the 70s, they developed Nomex, and this is the first generation Nomex coat we had. This was actually my old coat. That one was my old coat as well. And this was like a huge step up, because finally it was a material that wasn't meant to repel water. It was meant to protect the firefighters. So this was Nomex. We have a series of coats here, all in the different generations of Nomex. So this down here is a pretty wild piece of equipment. This is the air raid siren. So back in World War I and probably World War II mostly, a lot of the cities had air raid sirens. And earlier we saw the civil defense helmet. This was part of the civil defense system. So this air raid siren was located in the towers of City Hall. And we were able to operate it. I used to hear it. There was 2 air raid sirens, one here and one up on Cedar Avenue. But these were, only used probably during the World War II era. Probably weighs about 300 pounds, all solid steel. And this one still works, absolutely. In the background here is another interesting tool. This is called the Hebert hose clamp. This was a pretty critical piece of equipment as far as when you took the hydrant. Your hydrant man, your engineer would open that up. He would put the hose in there, clamp it down, and what that would do is stop the flow of water before it got to the engine. That gave the engineer time to make all his hookups, and then once this clamp was on, he could signal the hydrant person to open up the water, and this would hold the water. Then when the engineer was ready to receive water, he would open up the hose clamp very slowly with opening up this clamp. That would allow the water to get to the engine. So the Hebert hose clamp. Okay. So in this corner of the room, first a firefighter that dug, we got a mannequin, we dressed it all up, and some of the different air packs we had. This was the generation of air pack when I started. This is the Scott air pack, 30-minute, probably weighs about 40 pounds, solid steel cylinder. We have another one here. There's a 15-minute air pack. And then a huge step came when we finally went to the composite cylinder. This is a 30-minute air pack, the high pressure system. And this was an MSA. That was a Scott that we had before. And this was an enormous change as far as weight distribution. It was the first one that actually had steel coil inside. So in case the straps burned at all, they would still stay on the firefighter. So huge step in technology. This is some of the hats that came from the old Rose Bowl. Of course, there's a lot of history about the Rose Bowl. It basically funded a lot of the equipment and the station. And these were the lights from the Rose Bowl. It was right down this direction, down the alley, and on Kane Street was the old Rose Bowl, and these are some of the light fixtures from there. The cam siren, this was a siren that was the original siren manufacturer, and they actually were built in Ross, California. This used to be our old Squad 1. It was a 1960 GMC that we took it off of. So again, all these cabinets are filled with historical equipment, and a lot of the stuff we had on the engine was because of what we called ISO. But there's different parts of equipment in here. There's old spanners, old collections of fittings that we had on the engine. Down here was what we called the Cooper hose jacket. The Cooper hose jacket was in case you sprung a leak in the hose, you could clamp the Cooper hose jacket. And for ISO, the insurance rating for the fire department, that was worth like 5 points. So we had to keep that on, even though we would never use it, we kept it on the engine probably well through the 80s. These are the old log books. You know, everything back then, nothing was on computers. Everything was handwritten. When I started, everything was handwritten. And these were the different log books. We kept a lot of them, and they're actually a lot of fun to go through because you can see what we did. I mean, there was entries in the book like dust equipment. You know, I don't think the firemen do that anymore. Firefighters, excuse me. So, and then the trophies. These are some of the trophies here. Chief Lellis just pointed out that this was an original trophy from 1909. He said 1909. So back then, all the small fire departments had competitions between each other, and one year we were lucky enough to win it, and so that's the 1909. Of course, I wasn't here for that. And of course, the classic historical fireman's bugle, you know, before we had electronic sound systems or any kind of amplifying, we would use the fireman's bugle to, hello, pull the line. So this was pretty much the symbol of the fire department, and a lot of the chief's badges and fire captain badges are all revolve around this symbol, and that's the bugle. So, and this is an example of some of our box alarm systems. This was the first box alarm system, so before 911, even when I started here, Marin County in the mid-70s did not have 911. So we were still reliant on a 7-digit phone number or the box alarms. And so we had about 40 of them around town. This was the first generation. This was the second generation that I actually rehabbed myself. And this was at the corner of Piedmont and Magnolia. And each alarm system had a number. So this was box number 25 or 23. And so when you pulled this system, it would run through a wire coming into the fire station here, and it would activate the diaphone on the roof. Now the diaphone was a really loud horn it had a distance of 7 miles, so you could hear it for 7 miles away. And that was all part of the Gamewell system. This is our second generation, so when you pulled this box, the horn would go off 2 times and then 3 times. And still working when I started here. And then this was the third generation fire alarm. You open it and just pull the switch, and that's how you activated it. And so these were the 3 box alarm systems. And then this was the Gamewell. This is an antique box, probably over 100 years old, well over 100 years old. And when this box alarm would go off, the first generation, it would send a signal to the fire station of which box it was. Then you had to pull that number out, put it into the activator. What they do, pull the hook, and that would signal all the firemen in town where the fire was. So a very simple system in some ways, a very complex system in others. And all these box alarms, each system was tied to one cable that started in the fire station, went through the whole city, came back to the fire station, up to the horn, and they all intersected in the office downstairs. So it was quite a setup back in the day. Down here are some of the old resuscitators, you know, when obviously when I started, the medical part was a big component of what we did here, but we literally had suitcases to carry into these homes for a resuscitator. This was what they call an E&J resuscitator. This was probably vintage 60s, and we would have these suitcases, and so we would schlep these things into these medical aid calls. Certainly by the time I left, everything was so much more higher tech and so much more user friendly. So yeah, that's this section of the room.
Jim, I got a question for you. All those little brass discs in there, did they, each one of those correspond with a fire alarm box in town?
Right, so when the old system, when you pulled that, each of these has these little teeth, and the little teeth would, when you put it into the actuator, each tooth was a number. So all these little brass circles in here all have a different number. So when the signal was, let's say, again, Magnolia and Piedmont, you would grab number 23, put it into the actuator, pull the hook, that would set the horn off for number 23.
Now, how did all the firemen memorize what 23 was, or?
Every fireman had a card, and I don't see that. I know the card's in the room. It was a card with a list. So at home, they would look on their card and go, okay, box 23, and they'd either come to the station or go to the fire. Yeah. So pretty, you know, it was just the way we had to communicate back then, and certainly, you know, it was. But it worked, you know.
Now let me ask you, when you mentioned before, Jim, that this was all pre-telephones, before people had telephones in their homes. Now, you mentioned before 911, the 911 system went into place, you had a 7-digit number.
Right.
Now, did Comm Center or Twin Cities Dispatch pick that up? How did that work?
Well, when I started, the 7-digit number, which was 924-1442, it would ring into this station. We had no central dispatch. We had no police doing it. It came to this station, and we called it the hotline, and it was a red phone. And when it rang, it rang a special bell upstairs and downstairs, and you'd pick it up. But the interesting thing is, if someone else in the station, everyone could pick up a phone and listen in to see what was going on, and it would also go to a speaker. And then now the problem is we had a campaign about every phone in Larkspur had to have a sticker that said what the fire department number was, because sometimes these fires got a lot bigger back then because people were going to the phone book, trying to find the phone number, and then calling it. And it would cause a huge delay. And obviously with the 911 system, everyone knew 911 and they could dial it. But back then it was 7 digits. And some of the phones were rotary dials. So and it was 9, that would take a long time, 2, 4, you know, that's how they dialed it in. So,
I would like to thank Captain Jim Clark for this great presentation of the Doug Archer Historical Room. Jim, I really do appreciate your history, your recall. It's great to see that your old turnouts.
The old turnouts, well,
are doing a great job hanging over
it's
there.
my pleasure, and it's nice to reminisce, and I'm lucky I only live a few blocks away.
That's true, he only does, but I'm hoping you enjoyed this presentation, and maybe sometime in the near future we'll all be able to visit this place. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.